So we hear today from Job 38. We read verses 1 through to 7 and then 34 to 41. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourselves like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, 'Here we are'? Who endowed the heart with wisdom, or gave understanding to the mind? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of earth stick together? Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food?" For the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Sorry, a sneaky translation change. I don't know where my printed reading came from, but there was wisdom in the ibis, and I'm like, this is interesting. Like it was the right thing, but it was the wrong thing all at the same time. But hey, yeah, there's wisdom in bin chickens. Think about that this week, or if next time you're at South Bank. Those things know how to fend for themselves, so they've got it from somewhere. It's always fun preaching after Ray. He likes to change my sermon. Well, not change it, but you add, and I'm like, oh, actually, that's not an angle I really went. But Proverbs 8 is fascinating in that often we hear of wisdom as Sophia wisdom, or as the Holy Spirit, if you want to go there. And we will hear later where that wisdom is put into creation. And God says it fairly succinctly to Job. So if you remember last week, Job's here yelling at God, waving his fist in the air. Well, the Simpsons would say old man yells at cloud. But he's waving his fist and saying, you know, what is going on? Like, everything's been taken from me. He's getting terrible advice from his buddies. Who can relate? Yes. Because they're just saying, Job, this is all happening because you've done something wrong. Just repent. Like, it is actually that simple. And we all know suffering and trouble is not. If only the answer was always that clear. There's a theologian, N.T. Wright, and he has this a really good radio podcast. And radio podcast, is that a thing? Radio podcast? It's either on the radio or it's a podcast. Anyhow, I digress. And someone said of his question and answer type style, he said, the great thing about N.T. Wright, if you ask him a question, what he'll say is what you meant to ask, and then he'll answer the question he wanted to. But you're so satisfied with what he said anyway that you forget that he's just completely changed the conversation. I need to get better at that. And that's almost where we are today. Like Job is yelling at God for answers, and God is kind of looking at him saying, you know, well, here's your question, but let's reframe it. Because the answer I'm going to give isn't just black and white. The answers your friends are giving, certainly, they are black and white and it doesn't work. So let's just change our focus and align our thoughts in a different way. So how often do we kind of have prayer answered? We want it answered like this and it's answered like this. So often hindsight will come into this. But to begin looking at today, I'll give you a quote from Richard Volodas. He wrote He's from a multicultural kind of Pentecostal church in the Bronx, and he's written this new text of, the rhythms of the spiritual life, even in city parishes. And so he goes from being kind of out there charismatic to quiet, still, meditative, contemplative type thing. And so to quote from this article that he wrote, he said, "One of my favourite stories about Mother Teresa has to do with her description of prayer." Now, obviously, we're talking about how Job he may be yelling at God, but he's praying. So we are always talking about prayer here. She was once asked about her prayer life. The interviewer asked, "What does she say to God when she prays?" And her answer was, "I don't talk, I simply listen." Believing that he understood what she had just said, the interviewer then asked, "What then is it that God says to you in prayer?" Mother Teresa replies, "He doesn't talk. He also simply listens." So there was a long silence, much like yours trying to figure that one out. He seemed a bit confused. He didn't know what to ask next. And Mother Teresa breaks the silence saying, "If you can't understand the meaning of what I've just said, I'm sorry, but there is no other way I can explain it better." So Rich Villados, in summarising, prayer is the act of listening to God listen. If you weren't already confused about prayer, prayer is the act of listening to God listen. And I'm going to leave that there for now. And then we'll come back to it, and hopefully it makes sense why I've mentioned it. Job has many questions for God. As we know, God kind of hands Job over to Satan around only a few small parameters. Don't take his life. There's life being lost around him. He's losing everything. He has many questions. It is tragic. He is angry. He is yelling at God. Almost like, bring him here, let me have a chat. Kind of like trying to keep the friends holding him back, trying to keep his cool. It's probably you. It's like, no, bring me God, and we'll sort this out. And so today we have God's answer. And in God's answer, and we will also hear, when we heard of our gospel, how Jesus had to answer the disciples, often there's kind of miscommunication or misunderstanding. We're asking questions at one level, God's answering at another, and I don't know who's getting more frustrated. That answer is probably us. He's very patient. So we're looking for answers that are sometimes clear. Sometimes we're looking for answers that are none of our business. And sometimes the answer is just not what we want. But despite that, when God speaks to us in prayer, he will give us some form of direction. So when God answers Job here today, we'll see him changing Job's questions and frustrations and almost focusing on, actually, let's for a moment just stop and think about the character of who you're talking to. Remember a few weeks ago when we first opened Job, he kind of set up the character of God and the character of Satan. And now we're coming back, and God's going to say, actually, Job, look at who you're talking to. So in Job 38, 1 and 2. So the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm, and he said, "Who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" Now, we are a church that likes to express itself through many things and in many ways. But we would often say, I have a word from the Lord. And we have a caution right here that says if we speak words without knowledge, so that is knowledge of the wisdom of God, it will obscure the plans of God, or can. So there's a big warning straight up from God, like, it's almost like God saying, calm down, when you're furious. So next time, be like, honey, are you speaking words without knowledge? Try that one instead, maybe. But words without knowledge are showing a lack of the wisdom of God. It is showing speech from a place of humanity that does not always get the will of God right. And so this is confounded further when we get back in verse 36, where it is said, asked, who put the wisdom in your inward parts? Who is it that gives understanding to the mind? So when we are trying to fathom, what is wisdom? What is the knowledge of God? And so we ask, well, from where do we gain wisdom? Can we trust our human nature interpreting the will of God? Because Job's mates have all sorts of advice for him, but it is words without knowledge. It may be coming from a nice, heartfelt place, but it is without the knowledge or wisdom there of God. So in our other readings today, in our Hebrews, which you didn't hear, but I'll touch upon some of that, and in Mark, we see that even with Christ, he showed reverence to the Father. He submitted to God, and he learned obedience, and therefore exhumed his wisdom. Sounds a bit strange saying that Christ learnt this stuff. But he learnt this reverence and this submission and this obedience. So he humbled himself before the one that gives the wisdom. And so we hear God saying here to Job, you are speaking words that are not my own. I'm not going to rebuke you for that, but what I'm going to say is actually look at who it is you're talking to. And so when we speak words without the work in discovering if these are godly words, then we're tempted to ask the wrong questions, and we don't even know it. In the gospel, we hear the disciples ask questions, and you think they would know better. They're walking with Christ, and he says, you don't know what you're asking. We're just like, stop and think what you're asking, but not only what you're asking, who you're asking it of. And so God then continues to Job. So he's letting him know, don't speak out of turn type thing. Speak from my wisdom. And then he says, I will actually question you, and you will answer me. In the NRSV translation is, I will question you. So God's saying, I will question you, I'll ask the questions, and you will declare me, he says. You will declare me. And that is, when I was trying to figure out, why they've chosen declare here. Declare is to experience and to learn to know. So I will ask you questions, Job, but when God asks questions of us, we learn to know and experience the character of God. And not only that, think about what God is that you're experiencing him. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? So I'm saying, buddy, you've got a personal relationship here with the creator of everything. Let me ask the questions, and you grow in me. You must allow yourself to experience me, which means letting go of things that we hold on to. And if we go back to that proverb, in these foundations of the earth is the Spirit that we experience out of now, that Sophia wisdom. So I will ask the questions. I, who laid the foundations of the very world. And then later he says to Job here in 36, and who is it that put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? How is that Sophia wisdom working? Who put wisdom in you? Who puts words of knowledge in you but the creator of the world? So it's not you don't know who you're asking or what you're asking. It's almost actually stop, consider and worship this relationship you are getting and experience me and learn to know me. And learning to know God and to grow in wisdom is to allow Christ to form within us. So wisdom's already there at creation. I'm throwing this back to Ray. Ray said that, so if you've got a theological issue with it, I'm going to put it on Ray. It's all a broad context thing. You can take anything out of context and say that was... But the wisdom was there at creation. Christ, the Word, was there in creation. And this is whom we're allowed a relationship with. This is where we get wisdom and knowledge, and our creative selves even. And so we're getting these hints that actually, if you want to know me deeper, if you want to experience me, then look to the person of Christ, and we have that example. Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. If we want to know and experience God, then that's the example that the Son gives us. That's the example we get of life that grows in the knowledge and wisdom of God, and it happens through obedience and reverence and prayer and praise of the Father. So, and then much like, God speaking to Job and deflecting the answers away from specific instructions, in Hebrews we hear of the description of the Son. The Son, though he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. These are continued revelations of who God is and of his character. So the one in whom we are growing with and growing into, and who we are experiencing, we get it from the very source of our salvation and creation. We get it from the answer. We can ask questions of God. We can query God. I think we can shake our fists and yell, well, what next? I figure even if you're yelling at him, you're praying. Keep that going. But God's almost saying here to Job, buddy, just take a step back and worship. Can we take a step back and give thanks and praise and grow in wisdom by that reverence, by obedience that we see in the life of Christ? Because it is there, and this is Rich Velotis again, it is there and the internal way that we are transformed. We are transformed from the inside out. by that Spirit that was there at creation, by that Spirit that is in us, by that wisdom that God has placed in us. And then we are transformed by saying yes again and again to Christ's self-giving, Christ poured out, Christ's redemptive love. We receive it and are formed by it. You will experience, you will learn to know from the very source of our salvation and creation. And so to flip back around to where we began, we begin all this in prayer. The act of listening to God, listen. We cannot speak words of knowledge, we cannot speak God's wisdom without knowing his character and nature. We cannot experience him without relationship with him. And we can't hear from him if we never close our mouths. So Rich Velodis' encouragement is to take 5 minutes each day in silent prayer. But I want you to do it not with anything in mind other than actually I'll be silent. And think about that statement that I'm listening and God's listening. And see how in those moments, if we continue to do that daily, God will speak to that inner wisdom, that inner spirit. He will communicate with it and grow in experiencing life together with not just the God of creation, but of our very salvation. Now, I would normally conclude a sermon with prayer, but seeing as I'm saying prayer is listening to God listen, we'll just take a few minutes now and listen to God listening, whatever that means to you. This again is from Proverbs 8:22. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, when he had not yet made earth and the fields or the world's first bits of soil. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above and established the fountains of the deep. He assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him, like a master worker. And I was his daily delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race.